So I know it's been a very long time since I've uploaded anything to this channel, and that's really just because I've been busy finishing up all of my degree programs. But now that I'm kind of done with all of that, I can finally return to making regular content on this channel again. So just stay tuned for that over the coming weeks and months. What I want to tackle in this video in particular is in response to a patron of mine who asked me to respond to RT Mullins' objections to classical theism. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of RT Mullins. He kind of is on this crusade against classical theism. He's very big on the whole theistic personalist picture of God, and he wants to really push back against doctrines like divine simplicity, the divine impassibility, key doctrines like that. So I wanted to devote this video in particular to answering at least one of those objections. I do plan to go in a bit more depth with Mullins in the future, but I really just want to touch on, in this shorter video, a response to one specific objection that Mullins has against classical theism. And that would be the objection that under classical theism, it's really impossible to predicate the property of being Lord of the universe, of God, without being committed to the notion that creation would be somehow necessary, or that there would be some sort of contingency in God himself. And this is because, on Mullins' view, on the divine simplicity account, at least the broader perception of its presentation, every predication of the divine has to be itself identical with the divine essence, so that if we predicate lordship or creator of God, then in order to preserve the meaning of those conceptions, that over which he is Lord and that which he creates would have to be, at least in some sense, co-eternal with him, or would have to share in his aseity in some way. Now, what I would say in response to this, however, is that its major premise, it seems to me, is founded on a misconception of the doctrine of divine simplicity. And that is that the doctrine of divine simplicity means that there's absolutely no sense in which Cambridge properties, which are predicated extrinsically of a thing, could be predicated of God. I think they can be, and I think we have to be clear about what divine simplicity really commits you to and what it doesn't commit you to. Now, what it does commit you to is the idea that everything that is predicated of God as he is in himself must be identical with his essence, and that his essence can in no wise be composed of metaphysical or physical parts. What it does not commit you to is the idea that there cannot be any extrinsic properties that could be predicated of God. We can predicate certain conceptions that are thoroughly derived from God's relationship to creatures on God, so long as we aren't meaning to predicate them of God as he is in himself, as though they were intrinsic properties of him that would obtain as understood by creatures and in creation, even wholly anterior to God's creation of the world. But, that being said, I think there's perhaps even a more fundamental means of approaching this issue. It's all well and good to defend sort of the logical possibility of Cambridge extrinsic properties being predicated of God in some way. But I do think that we have to give sort of a fuller account of how this relates to his inner simplicity. And that is, I would argue that the intrinsic referent that serves as the basis upon which we call God Creator and Lord is accounted for within the simple superessential activity of God as he is in himself. And this is because the very divine act of creation, in its essential activity, considered wholly anterior to the created effects which proceed from that divine act, they can, in some real way, be understood as identical with the divine substance. And this is because creation, considered from the standpoint of God as he is in himself, is identical with God's self-diffusive willing of his own goodness. And in willing his own goodness, he also knows thereby all of the ways in which his goodness can be reflected finitely and participated in. And therefore, every act of God, considered ad extra or from without, is none other than the same divine self-willing, but in a freely chosen, finite, and limited manner. Thus, to predicate lordship of God can indeed be predicated of the divine substance insofar as it answers to the same intra-divine activity which serves as the ontological basis for its outward procession toward the creatures over whom he is Lord. Even if God did not freely choose to create the universe, his intra-divine activity in its infinitude would virtually contain all of the finite and limited modes in which that inner divine activity could be reflected and participated in. And so all of the predications that pertain to his activity towards creatures can still be predicated of God without being committed to the notion that the act of creation imposes any kind of necessity on God himself. And that's because any divine procession towards creation is merely a finite reflection of that inner divine activity, which is eternal and necessary in God's own inner life. So I hope that sort of short explanation was a bit helpful, and if you have any questions about that, just leave them in the comments below, and I'll try to help clarify a bit. As for what I kind of plan to go on to in the next few weeks and months for this channel, I do plan to do a pretty lengthy and in-depth presentation on the metaphysics of gender, informed by, a Thomistic and broadly scholastic vision of the world. I also plan to continue my series on metaphysics and integralism and other things, the Divine Name series. And I also kind of want to get into my thoughts about Pope Francis and sort of the discrepancies between recent magisterial teachings and preconciliar magisterial teachings, because I think there's a lot of hysteria that sends people down the wrong path, unfortunately, on discerning these urgent theological controversies. So I'd like to do sort of my part in addressing that, because I think it's important. I'll also sort of just post shorter videos on various theological topics and answers to frequently asked questions that I get from time to time. I'm kind of starting to realize that not every video has to be sort of this in-depth essay or something of that nature. So you can expect definitely more uploads, even if a lot of them are going to be shorter and a bit more simplified. But I think that's okay. So stay tuned for all of that, and God bless.